In one of the earlier years at Black Hat, I was going down an escalator and some of the attendees were coming up the escalator, and this guy yelled at me and he said, "That's the guy that got me a job because I spoke at Black Hat."
Crazy.
But at that point, the market was trying to find ways to differentiate people, and hey, here's a guy that spoke and he must know what he's talking about, and it helped his career. I access my traditional Office apps through the web browser, email all through the browser now. I mean, the browser's eating the world. I hate to say this, but it's who you know. A lot of your breaks in life
Absolutely,
are
I
going to
agree
come
with
from
you.
your friends of friends. You're going to work with someone, they're going to remember you, they're going to recommend you to someone else. Very rarely have I ever heard somebody say, I got a blind hit on a resume.
Right.
It's almost always through somebody who knew someone who knew somebody.
Welcome everyone to the very first inaugural edition of the Be Fearless podcast by SquareX. And of course, it's the inaugural edition. We really wanted somebody special. And, who could be more special to the whole hacker and cybersecurity community than, Jeff himself. Jeff needs no introduction. I've personally been a big fan of his work, at DEF CON and all of the other conferences, including Black Hat that he created. I started my whole career. So, Jeff has been doing this for over 30 years now, which is crazy period of time. And he's inspired an entire generation of, hackers, cybersecurity folks, researchers. And I guess, DEF CON started off pretty much as the mother of all cybersecurity conferences, both, hacking as well as non-hacking. Jeff, welcome to the show. It's an honor and a privilege to have you.
Hey, thanks, Vivek. It's funny you bring that up, that I'm known for DEF CON and Black Hat, but that was sort of an accidental second reinvention of myself, because when I was even younger, I ran a bulletin board, like a hacking information sharing bulletin board. And I ran that for years, right, all through high school and college, and I accidentally blew up the hard drive, shorted it out. It was so expensive. We used quick 40 backup tapes back in the day. And of course, it didn't restore.
Yeah.
So I'm essentially almost out of what I've been doing for years and years and years. And at that time, the internet was becoming the new thing, right? People were transitioning from X25 and dial-up. And so, I like to say it was not a master plan on my behalf. I was sort of in the right place at the right time and didn't screw it up.
And Jeff, even to kind of go back even further, like how did your interest in like hacking and cybersecurity kind of like peak? You started the BBS and all.
Yeah.
But like, what was the starting point?
Starting point was piracy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sharing games with friends on the block. And I remember it was it must have been the year of the PC, because it was this one Christmas, and one kid got like a TI 44A computer, and somebody else got a color computer, somebody else got a TRS Model 3. We got an IBM PC, somebody else got an Apple II, and just everybody got them. And they were all different. So everybody spent time trying to figure out, well, what does yours do? Well, I've got IBM Adventure, right, on CGA screen. And so we all shared. Well, of course, nobody really as kids had any money, so we'd all try to copy and trade each other's games and swap floppies if we could. So it really started from trying to figure out why we couldn't. And then that was essentially PC modding back then, was you'd change a timing crystal to accelerate your CPU, right? So you could play the game a little faster. And through making friends with kids in the school, who else in school had them, right? You had to figure out everybody that had the same kind of computer so you could try to trade with them. And I met somebody that had a modem, 300 baud modem. And I ended up going to his house once after school. And it was like, opened my eyes. There's a whole nother world out there, and they're dialing up. And in that time, I was living in the Bay Area. So it was essentially Silicon Valley, right? Yeah. And you're in essentially the calling area. And so the whole valley was full of bulletin boards, very rich. So I just assumed that's how the world was. And later on, we moved to Seattle. As my family moved to Seattle, I realized there's a lot of bulletin boards in Seattle, but it's not that usual. So I just got really lucky to be kind of in the right place at the right time with this kind of technology explosion. And then that's where I got the idea for the bulletin board, right? I like going on them so much. It's like, well, I spend so much time on them, I may as well just have my own to save time from, because back then, you had to manually, at least the one I had, you had to manually dial, right?
Yeah.
And so you would spend your time memorizing all the numbers, and you spend a lot of time doing that. It's like, well, if I had my own board, people would call me. Me having to call all them. I mean, still call friends' boards. And so that ended up being and then you find your niche, and then that taught me, FIDO networking, and then that, and on and on and on. And then so when the internet came along, a lot of the thought process was already in my head. And I remember the hacking part. It's funny, we're going to talk about this. The hacking part that really opened my eyes to it. So, okay, in bulletin boards, you're the sysop, system operator, right? So I'm the sysop of my system, and we had all these text files and everything. And we had an upload-download ratio to try to encourage people to upload. You just couldn't dial up, leech, tie up the phone number or the phone line for hours, and then never give anything back. So everybody had ratios. Kind of like what BitTorrent private seeders do now. Except as a sysop, everything's happening in essentially single user mode. You can see everything that's happening, everything the other person's doing, right? Nothing's hidden behind the scenes. Yeah. So you're sitting there and you're watching him and he's downloading something. And I'm getting ready to bust into sysop chat to chat with the guy. And so I'm waiting for him to finish downloading this file. 96%, 97%, 98%, 99%, 100%, rewind, error, 99%, download terminated. Like, the download never completed, but so I busted into chat, and I'm like, hey, what's going on? And he's like, oh, hey, man, sorry about that. I won't do it again. What are you talking about? Right? And he revealed that he had a hacked version of this download tool.
Interesting.
What it would do is it would download, get 100%, verify the checksum on the last block, but then it would report back that it had a checksum error. Please resend the last block.
Okay.
And then it would terminate because it had 100%.
Yeah.
But the upload-download ratio would never be impacted. So it never hit his download ratio.
Interesting.
So it's like, okay, give me that tool. Like, I'll forgive you if you give it to me, right? So he gave it to me, and then that opened my eyes. Like, oh, you can totally fool these systems, And that was it. That was the beginning. Actually, it was catching the guy hacking my system. Showed me kind of how it actually worked. Because you could read about it. You could read the text files, right?
Yeah.
I was programming C back then. But I wasn't programming it or thinking about it with that mindset,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's an incredible story. And you're right. I mean, a lot of that inquisitiveness starts to begin with us seeing somebody do a hack. Mm-hmm. And then you suddenly realize that, there is this different part of the brain that you can activate where you can force systems to do things they weren't supposed to do.
Yeah.
And that's an incredible story. And Jeff, from there, right, how did you conceptualize, the whole DEF CON conference? Was that initially a meetup, I understand?
Yeah. So, it was just like my bulletin board ended up going away. Luckily, that drive failed after I'd announced DEF CON. And so what had happened was another board I was networking with, a popular network, Platinum Net, was going away, and we were going to throw a going away party for all of its members. Nice. And most of the members were in America, but the organizer was in Canada. Okay. And I was his biggest hub in America. And so he said, hey, we should do it there because that's where everybody is. And I said, okay, great. I'll figure it out. And I figured out maybe Vegas. And then he disappeared, and I never heard from him again. His family is moving, and that's why he had to shut it down. But something happened, and he just sort of disappeared. And I keep telling the story, hoping one day he'll reach out to me, and he never has.
Crazy. Yeah.
So then I decided, well, if I was going to invite those members, I may as well invite all the other members. And then I may as well go on this thing called Usenet and invite everybody on comp security and alt privacy, right? And if I'm doing that, I may as well contact 2600 magazine, right? And so it went from this party, and I already put the energy into it. And so I was like, well, why not just invite
everybody? Yeah.
And the backdrop to this is that there were other hacking conferences, but they were all invite only.
Okay. This
right.
Is
so
an open
SummerCon, you had to get an invite. HoHoCon, you had to get an invite. PumpCon, you had to get an invite. And so mine was like, well, you don't have to get an invite.
Okay, nice.
Right. So it was just, and everything was mostly on the East Coast, or there's one down in Texas, and there really wasn't one on the West Coast. And so I kind of wanted it to be different. Right. And since I hadn't really got invites to the other ones, I'm going to just open it up to anybody. And it turned out, in hindsight, that was the magical option, right? That was a differentiator. It's open to everybody, and we invited everybody. And that kind of set the tone early on. And not being a marketer, not knowing any, I didn't realize that was like the smart move.
Right.
I did it because it was easy, and I didn't know necessarily who to invite everywhere. But by doing that first year, we got lawyers and engineers, and we got prosecutor, we got hackers, freakers, we got everybody. And it was that eclectic mix of everybody at the dawn of the internet age, all trying to figure out like what is going on, kind of really set that tone of, I mean, we sat in this room. Back then, we didn't shut down the room, which was a mistake. We started shutting down the room in the future years. But people stood up all night just talking, you know.
Nice. Okay.
And so I think that was the kernel. And then everything that happened was essentially inertia.
And how did you decide upon Vegas as the location? I mean, was there any specific reason, or because back then it was still like
then, so I had been to one HackerCon.
Okay.
And it was crazy because the lights went off. I mean, the town shut down, right? It was 5:30, 6 o'clock. And you had a hotel full of hackers and crazy parties and freakers, and there's nothing to do.
Yeah.
And so what are they doing? They're lighting trash cans on fire, pulling fire alarms, throwing party. I mean, it was out of control.
Yeah.
And I was like, I can't do that. It's got to be a place with cheap hotels, cheap food, things to do. Right. I'd never been to Vegas in my life.
Okay.
And my thought was, okay, I've got all the money in the world sunk into this, and I'd borrowed some money. and if it doesn't work out, at least I'm in Vegas. Right.
Okay.
And the money is small enough that I'm not bankrupt. I can do this. And it worked out. But over the years, Vegas has turned into such a hub.
Yeah.
But back then, it was a very kind of weird.
Oh, is it interesting? Okay.
So
There were no other conferences, nothing much going on.
No, it's just a weird kind of weird destination. And the hotels used to love us because nothing goes on in the summer in Vegas. And they were happy to have the business. Now Vegas is busy all year round, right? So we're not special anymore in that event. They're so successful now with Vegas that.
Yeah. So in the very first DEF CON, Jeff, at that time, did you already have like this whole talks and things like that? Or was it just people talking to each other?
Yeah. So the idea was, so maybe you remember in the early days, right, there was no Google or Amazon. Right. There are no books on any of this. So the way you learned is you had to find a mentor, right? And you could find a good one or a bad one, right? If you got unlucky and you happened to be mentored by somebody who is a sociopath or a criminal or whatever, like that could impact you, right?
Right.
And so a lot of what was said was like myth or like a legend. Like, well, if you put this on your bulletin board and you say no undercover police officers allowed, and then they come in, then that's entrapment. And I remember thinking that can't be, or else everybody just put that on the bulletin board and the police can't do their job, right? That doesn't make sense. So the first point of DEF CON was to dispel all those myths, right? Mm-hmm. Like, let's hear right from the horse's mouth. So that's why we got a prosecutor. How does it really work, right? Back then, the god of Unix security was Dan Farmer at Sun Microsystems, right? When Sun was the dot in .com.
Pretty much, yeah.
And so we got all these, Dr. Ludwig, who was this the virus creation toolkit. He created the big book of computer viruses, right? Yes. He was one of the first kind of researchers on this, right? So he came and talked about viruses. And so the idea was like, I'm so used to hearing bullshit from people on conference calls. Like, I want to hear from the real people. And then by doing that, we dispelled all this. And that's kind of where the value was.
Yes.
And it all stemmed, again, from me wanting to know what's real and what's all this nonsense that people keep repeating online. But again, that turned out to be a formula of trying to hear from the actual practitioner. And so you can see how they all started to line up to create the foundation for a good show.
Yeah, no, absolutely amazing. I mean, in a way, you kind of like slowly started killing the disinformation, as you kind of said, with people just making very tall claims or things which just sounded unbelievable.
Yeah.
And from there, getting the right people kind of like talking about it, explaining it to others and all of that. I mean, you've come an amazingly long way, right? Like right from that small group to now 25, 27, 28,000 people.
Yeah.
Just the scale of the conference is just mind-boggling. My first DEF CON was DEF CON 15, and that was the very first time I spoke main stage. And I've kind of seen everything grow. So, tell us a little bit about the scale of the conference, the sheer amount of hard work that goes, into kind of organizing something so ginormous.
It went from a hobby to a full-time job, essentially. And then I grew. And we have almost 500 goons that make it happen, right? Wow. Almost 500 people. And if you count the other people who help build the content, we call them, the creators, the people, villages, contests, event, workshops, demo labs, whatever it is, the people bringing the content, right? We probably have another almost 1,500 of those. So so if you say 20,000, 25,000 people, over 2,000 of those are the people doing the content or making it happen, right? The engine, right? It's just a lot of people to make it happen. And so it's so much bigger than you are, right? And so you kind of like point the super tanker in that direction, right? And you hope it gets to the port. And you do all you can, right? And you have all the best engineers to try to make it work. But you just don't ever know what's going to happen. And I remember around DEF CON 3, the show basically, people started coming to me, telling me stuff that happened at DEF CON at 3. Oh, did you see that? Oh, that was... It's like, no, I didn't see that. It's my own show, and I didn't see it, right? Like that sense of, oh, it's bigger than you now, right? That sucks. But I have to be okay with it, right? You can't unless you're just building it as a vanity project for yourself. Right. It's meant to be bigger, right? Yeah. So once I kind of emotionally got through that, then embraced it. I think then that was another kind of growth period. And there's this one well-known hacker back then, Jericho. And he had this observation, long-time reviewer of content, and he had this observation that DEF CON is essentially a meta-conference. It's a conference of conferences. Right. And once we started thinking about the con that way, it was really helpful because really what we're doing is we're saying, Packet Hacking Village, you've got some cool stuff going on.
Makes sense.
Great, we'll give you some, right? And that model of not having to be the master of everything, but instead deciding who to platform, where to grow, I think that's been one of our secrets.
Yeah, makes sense. And I've seen those villages really grow and become like, absolute hubs.
Oh, yeah.
Where, anytime you go, let's say, into the wireless village, I used to do a lot of Wi-Fi hacking. You almost always find the best people out there coming together, collaborating, sharing knowledge, teaching others. So, I can attest that model has been amazing. So I've seen so many people just directly now go to the villages.
Right.
Because, of course, there's these massive lines that we had to go through sometimes, for the main stage talks.
And then we give away the talks. And so that was another thing that sort of by accident.
Right.
So we recorded the first DEF CON audio, and I was selling it. I think it was $20. And it was like, a box of cassette tapes because there was no any other way of distributing. And I think by DEF CON 2 or 3, Real Media, had a streaming audio platform, right? We had a better connection. And I just hated duplicating these tapes and packaging them and shipping them out. So I just encoded them all and put them online for free. But then that created this norm that you give away your talks. Nobody else was giving away talks. No one was even recording talks.
Yeah.
And so we sort of created this standard that, no, you record your talks and you give them away for free. And then that actually helped later on with DEF CON because people say, well, that line's kind of crowded. I'll catch that later on. Instead, I'll go do this other thing. And it freed up people to not have this anxiety about what to do.
Yeah. And I can actually tell you, the impact of that is even wider. I was born and brought up in India. And there was a time when, my only window into what was really happening in the hacking and security world is whatever I could find online. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, I've watched so many of those DEF CON videos back in the day when I was still in school and starting to learn, starting to get inspired. So, the impact is much broader. And the incredible part really was that based upon all of that, when I finally went into security research, my very first goal was what can I do so that I could probably go and speak at DEF CON. So yeah, incredible
I was just
impact.
being lazy. Yeah. No, but again, like I said, it's a series of these decisions that created.
Correct.
Yeah, and then it's amazing when I hear stories like your own. you imagine that's probably what's happening. You hope that people are watching the videos. You hope that all that work that went into it, right? That people are taking it and doing something with it. But you just don't have a feedback loop. You just don't know.
Yeah.
And so then when I hear your story and others, I'll tell you briefly. The first time I realized something was really going on was one of the earlier years at Black Hat, and I was going down an escalator, and some of the attendees were coming up the escalator, and this guy yelled at me, and he said, "That's the guy that got me a job because I spoke at Black Hat." And it had not dawned on me that it was a career advancement move.
Yeah. Crazy.
But at that point, the market was trying to find ways to differentiate people. And hey, here's a guy that spoke, and he must know what he's talking about. And it helped his career. And he was literally shouting out to me about it. Okay.
And I can tell you actually, having being a speaker at DEF CON on your resume is actually a very big thing. I mean, even today, back in the day, of course, you were like a unicorn for, what is this? So few talks and so few speakers that if you spoke at DEF CON, and I still remember when I put that on my resume, sent it to Cisco Systems, a bunch of other companies and startups in the Bay Area, people were interested to talk because they were like, hey, you know what? So few people were doing, hacking and security research. And if you're one of them, we'd love to talk to you because you work in security. Yeah,
it's again, had I realized, right? Maybe I'd have a whole career track.
And which brings me to, another very interesting point is, I mean, you started DEF CON and that was already so big, and you also started Black Hat.
Right.
So, if you could share a little bit about what was the Black Hat story? Why did you decide to do a second conference?
It's kind of funny because, we're talking about these conferences, but when you look at it through the lens of business,
right?
It's essentially, I couldn't do, there's an old Unix graybeard, Ray Kaplan, literally graybeard, right? Literally worked at the original kind of Unix companies. And he said, wow, this is great. You should charge a lot of money for it and target it toward business. Because they'll pay, and they want different things out of it, right? They need something that they can expense, like nobody's expensing this, right? They need a description. They need something that sounds like useful,
right?
Instead of a party invitation, because our announcements were, come to the party, and so I thought about that, and so the next year at DEF CON, I wrote a fake announcement that made DEF CON sound like a business thing, right? And then people would take that, go to their businesses, and they would. And then I said, that was such a pain to do that. I don't want to have 2 announcements every year. And so for that, I decided, okay, I'll try a Black Hat. I'll try it. And I came up with the name Black Hat. And it was in the same hotel right before, which was a disaster. Like Black Hat right before DEF CON. All the hackers show up early and they're like, hey, what's going on? And it was a madhouse. So we split them into 2 different hotels later. But the whole point was one was hacker and one was more InfoSec, right? One was more for businesses. And over time, that distinction, maybe in the early days, was kind of a distinction without a difference. But over time, it became a huge difference because the people who started showing up at Black Hat were Cisco, integrators, telecom, aerospace. Everybody started to show up. And they were showing up for different reasons than people that were showing up at DEF CON, right? And so there were clearly 2 different markets. And I just had gotten lucky enough that my friend Ray had said, you should do this other thing.
Yeah.
And I remember I was working at professional services at a company called Secure Computing Corporation, the first company to ever list on the NASDAQ in the internet age, a security company, and from San Jose. And I was running the professional services section doing pen testing and all this stuff. And they're about to sell the services group. And did I want to go with the new acquirer? And I remember sitting down thinking, well, I'm kind of doing DEF CON on the side. I'm kind of doing Black Hat on the side. If I do nothing but spend a year and I get like 100 more people to show up at Black Hat, then I don't need the job. So I'll take a year and I'll try. And I made it. I think I got like 120 people or something, right? And it just kept working and kept working. And so because of that sale, forced me to choose my path in life, and I chose to try Black Hat. So again, not a master plan, but just kind of got lucky and made the right choice, right?
Yeah,
I figured I could always go back and do testing again, but I couldn't always start another.
Yeah, no, I think amazing story. And I mean, again, DEF CON and Black Hat still remain the biggest two conferences, the biggest two brands. And when it comes to, enterprises and companies participating, Black Hat still remains like the biggest one.
Yeah.
So one interesting thing is I know on your website, you always mention, hey, people are probably going to say in the last minute, DEF CON is cancelled.
Right.
But to ignore it because it, of course, never ends up happening.
Right.
But this
and
year
it was a joke. It was an online joke where somebody set up a website that said it was defcon.ws. I think the page is still there.
Oh, okay.
And it was this fake, right, defacement or whatever, and they would just like troll people with it. And so we'd always get these questions. People would be emailing, I heard it was canceled. It's like, where are you? They're f***ing with me again. And it's just kind of a funny thing that people do, but it turned into a meme. And then during COVID, it was actually, we couldn't do it in person, right? So we switched online.
Right.
And then this last year, it actually was canceled briefly. Because our venue, Caesar's Palace, terminated our contract on us.
Okay.
And so we were left 6 months before the show, before this year, to find another venue. And that never happens, right? In 30 years,
crazy.
Hotels don't terminate contracts like that. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. And the best I can tell, talking to a bunch of people, is that there was a ransomware attack last year, and it was against... through, I think, a third-party customer service vendor that was used, as far as I can tell, by MGM and Caesars.
Okay. Yeah.
And they both ended up getting
the news. Yeah.
Right. So MGM didn't pay the ransom. Caesars paid the ransom. They kind of approach it different. They're different kind of companies. They approach it differently. But MGM, big publicly traded company. Caesars recently acquired by a family-controlled publicly traded company, but family-controlled. And they just see risks differently. And so my feeling is they just said, there's the word hacker involved. We don't want it anymore. And then instead of saying, we don't want it anymore, you can do this as your last year, and then move on, they just pulled the plug all at once, right? So that, again, forcing us to sort of reinvent ourselves. So now we're going to the Las Vegas Convention Center, which is a giant space, but now we get to put everybody in one place in one time. And we haven't been able to put everybody in one place in a long time. So I'm thinking that's going to reinvigorate the community, much more spontaneous connection. You don't feel like you've got to walk from this hotel to that hotel. And what I'm hoping it does is kind of relaunch the community, especially in a year when right now the market's not doing so great. Tech industry is kind of flat. There's a lot of uncertainty, right? AI, disruption. And so maybe that means the people who show up really want to be there. And now we have a place for more of them to interact. And I bet the energy is going to be crazy.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And I'm super excited myself. I think, one single convention center with everything in there, as you rightly said, I personally used to hate walking between, all the hotels, and there's so much going on.
Yeah.
You always worry that you're going to miss because there's so much of, commute time, then waiting time for, lines and all of that.
It was this, and that's a byproduct of another decision that we made, which was we don't limit attendance.
Oh, okay.
So the idea was, and I think it was a byproduct of the invite-only thing, right, where I wanted to open it. Well, then the question is, if you're opening it to everybody, then when do you close it? And so we're like, well, we'll just close it when it gets to 500 people. You're like, but then you're rewarding the early bird. You're rewarding the person who's type A personality who's going to register early. But the most creative, interesting people sometimes are lazy, type Bs, right? So now you're selecting your audience. It's like, we can't do that. And so unintentionally, by not capping the attendance, right, we let anybody, you can decide at the last minute. You don't have to 3 months before buy a ticket. I've never liked that. You had to be so organized, right?
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And so I think that was it. Then that meant we had to bolt on these hotels to grow.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And so there's a plus and a minus, right? I'll cap attendance, but then you have these other things you're not going to like. So we always try to do the path that we thought helped the community more than hurt it.
Yeah,
but there's
absolutely makes sense.
It's always trade-offs.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, now I understand, and it's a great decision, because a lot of times, even me, at the very last minute, I've decided like, okay, you know, let's just book a ticket, let's go down to DEF CON, and you never have to worry.
Yeah.
Because you know that you can go ahead and, you know, purchase the ticket in the last minute.
Yeah.
And kind of be there.
And it's caused me to hate these vendors that sell their software by the seat. So like there's some great software, right? And I've got DEF CON, we're like 7-8 people. So it's like I need 10 seat licenses, right? For some endpoint. Oh, okay, yeah, minimum purchase like 100, 50, 200, 500. Like it's the same software. Just let me
Right.
It's like I don't understand the mentality, right? My mentality is anybody can come. Their mentality is you must buy at least 50 or 100. It's the same software.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't give me the same support. That's okay. I can figure it out. But yeah, it's poisoned the way in which I view the software industry as not being inclusive.
So Jeff, a lot of other interesting things going on as well. I noticed, you know, I think last year you did the whole inaugural DEF CON training sessions. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You know, what are your plans? What's the vision with DEF CON training?
So we started, it was about, I think 2 years ago.
2 years ago, okay.
We started, but it was just a proof of concept. So last year we tried it. And the idea is, like DEF CON, we were one of the only conferences that didn't have training. So when you looked at B-Sides and everybody across the world, the trend was that conferences had a lot of sponsorship and they had training. And we existed before there were sponsors. So historically, we've just never had sponsors because there were no sponsors, right? So that's kind of why we look different than others, because it wasn't an option for us. So we decided, well, we may as well do some training. Let's try training. But we wanted to try it a little differently. So the way we do it is to support the community, we split the revenue 50-50. Okay. And that's pretty unusual. Yeah, so it's pretty unusual. It's usually like 30-70 or 35-65 or something. But the idea was maybe there's people out there coming up that want to do some training and they don't have such a success, right? So it's a big deal to them. They're not maybe professional trainers. And then if you're really successful, you're already training all around the world or you're at other conferences. So that was our idea. But post-COVID, you know, the training world's been pretty tough. But we've gotten some really interesting submissions that for things that I wouldn't have seen at other major conferences because maybe it's the pool of people who train it or go to DEF CON and want to speak at DEF CON that also want to train. They want to come with all kinds of crazy ideas. And so I kind of want it to be an incubator. I want people to come and, you know, try different things. And then and if it doesn't work out, okay, no hard feelings. But I want DEF CON to remain a vibrant place where people can come and experiment, right? And it's not a super business where you have to meet these metrics and, you know, or else
makes sense.
Yeah.
And I can actually tell you, I mean, definitely it's going to be a success, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of times when people attend talks at DEF CON, I mean, that is a massively condensed, you know, download of something, you know, the speaker would have kind of experimented and learned over the past 1 year, 2 years, whatnot.
Yeah.
And many a times, I mean, I still remember, you know, there was this battery hacking talk which I attended years back.
Oh, yeah. That it was an embedded controller on a battery. Yeah.
Correct. And, you know, I kind of went in and I was like, okay, this is so condensed. I really wish if I could have attended a training from the same speaker so that he could have kind of broken all of those things down so that, you know, I could have interacted with him, tried things out on my own. So I really feel like there is a massive scope, and I think DEF CON training would be a very good outlet for that, where also many of these speakers who probably just want to do research could even find a way to go ahead and sponsor that research, right? By doing these trainings, you know, teaching the community. So yeah, I mean, good luck with that, and I really hope it works out.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I always assumed that after COVID, people would do everything remotely, but it turns out online remote training is not very popular.
Yes.
Even though you don't have to pay for the airfare, you don't have to pay for the hotel. There's all these savings, but people want to see people. People want to be around people, and that's why. Do you remember Cisco telepresence?
Yes.
Right, and they had these beautifully designed rooms, and it was fantastic. But people didn't like it, right?
Right.
And it was going to save all this airline fuel, and you could do more meetings and be more efficient. And then it was going to be VR, right?
Yeah.
And everything that was going to destroy the conference business never did
happened.
because
Yeah.
people want to be around people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think when COVID hit, especially with everybody doing,
Yeah.
completely virtual conferences, there was a time when they said, oh, you know what, conference businesses are never going to bounce back once again,
Right.
But right after, the vaccine went out and people started getting more comfortable, I think almost all conferences started getting massive footfall. People were so eager
Yeah.
to kind of just go back and
Back
meet.
to seeing humans.
Yeah. So Jeff, apart from DEF CON and Black Hat, I'm aware that, on a bunch of boards, public market companies, various government organizations, you work with various startups. Can you tell me a little bit about, that work and, what you've been doing lately?
Yeah, thanks. Again, it was sort of all by accident. So at Black Hat, we would offer, how did it go? A government room rate. So if you work for the government and you need to buy a hotel room, right, there are these government room rates. And we would always have hotel room block for the GSA rate. So every once in a while, somebody from the government would call and say, hey, do you have a rate? What do I do? And I remember I got a call once, came into Black Hat, and the person who answered the call said, hey, do you have time? There's this guy calling from the government. And I'm thinking, oh, he wants a discount or he wants something, So he transfers to me, and it's this guy, Jake. He's like, hey, do you want to, I found you online with the government, with the Department of Homeland Security, and we have this advisory committee we're putting together, right? And we need somebody that with some computer information security skills. And so I found you. Are you interested? And I said, okay. So he said, well, it's not paid. It's just every couple of months you might comment on a paper. I'm like, oh, sure, I can comment on. I'll comment on anything. Great, send me the papers. Okay, thanks, bye. And about 2 weeks later, I get all this paperwork, security clearance, background checks, ethical clearance, financial disclosure, all this stuff comes. I call him back, I'm like, what's going on? Like, this is not commenting on a couple. And but once you jump through that hurdle, and then I started on this advisory board for DHS, and then a friend of mine went and was the CEO at ICANN. Right. So then he needed somebody to help. ICANN had never had a full-time CSO. Sure, I'll go help. Because it's kind of exciting to go from the ground floor when there's not much there.
Right, absolutely.
So I go to help my friend at ICANN. And so within a short order of time, I went from this kind of InfoSec commercial focus, hacker, InfoSec, and next thing you know, I'm sort of like Homeland Security, national issues, and then international internet governance, global perspective. And I mean, those were 2 or 3 crazy years. I was at ICANN for about 3 years, and it completely changed my sort of perspective from a small, we're all interconnected on this network to, real systems of people and governance. And so from there, I was just really lucky. And from there, I've gone over to CISA advisory board for CISA, and they were formed, right? They didn't exist when I started at DHS. I'm doing some advisory work for the UK government. Everybody is trying essentially to figure it out, right? The space is moving so quickly. Right. Then you can throw in AI. Before that, you could throw in blockchain. You could throw in whatever. The space is moving super quickly, and everybody needs alternative voices and like
different perspectives.
Yeah, different perspectives, and just there. It's funny in government. It's almost never malice. It's always just right hand, left hand problems. Right? Okay. Everybody's trying to do the right thing, and sometimes they both try to do the right thing at the wrong time or something. And so it's been really eye-opening. The downside to it is you don't get to necessarily talk about everything. Right. And it kind of reminds me of my early hacker days where you had that relationship with a mentor or tutor, and they would tell you stories and hacks and things that weren't publicly known. But you internalize that. The same sort of thing happens here, right? You're getting an inside scoop from the government, or you're getting briefed by someone, and you don't get to go on Twitter and talk about it, right? But just like you wouldn't talk about what your hacker mentor told you, right? But it made you have a better understanding of the space. You could provide better advice. And I think I've been lucky enough when I sold Black Hat to have earned enough money that I wasn't pursuing the next big thing.
Right.
So instead, I just started doing these other things to satisfy my own personal interest. How does that work at internet governance? Oh, how does that work? And that's how I've been selecting where I put my time in. Because I'll tell you right now, it's no fun if you're trying to advise someone who doesn't want your advice.
Yeah.
So then don't give them your advice, right? But if you find people who honestly want your advice and you can be useful to them, valuable, and you're learning from them, it's not a one-way street.
Right.
Those are the best places, best places to be. And so that's why I think I've been putting my time in these areas. Yeah.
So I think, amazing, Jeff. So, as part of all of these roles, you'd be talking to, the top CISOs, CIOs, regulators, so at internet scale, at global scale, as of today, what are the most worrisome things that, everybody's talking about and dealing with?
Yeah, it's easy to say AI, but AI what? Because when I hear AI, I think algorithm. Right? What is the algorithm doing? Right? Is it being tuned for posting disinformation, misinformation, malinformation? Is it to identify pressure points in a society or a community and split them? Right? Maybe that's kind of what we're seeing with like a Russia or Iran or even maybe China with Canada. Or the other thing is regulators are kind of awake now, and they understand, right? When the infrastructure is being attacked, whether it's water or power, you hear about, they want to do something, right? Election interference 2016 really woke a lot of people up. And so I say it's this moment of, it's like, be careful what you wish for, because people would always say, if they only listen to us, when everybody ignores us, right? We know and they don't, and why don't they? Well, okay. But they also know something about policy that you don't. Right? They don't know what you know, but you don't know what they know. And so it's going to take both of us working together to probably get a solution. And so if you're wishing you're being listened to, now's the moment they're asking you questions. So if you screw that up by giving them crazy advice, they're not going to come back a second or third time to ask for your advice. They'll go somewhere else. Right? Because they still need to do their thing. But if you haven't helped them in doing that thing, they'll find somebody else who will. And so I've heard of horror stories where like the security people come in, the government, you've got to turn off this and you've got to do that. And never once did they say, what's your use case? What do you actually need to get done? And then we'll help you manage the risks or understand the risks. It's more of a, finally, they're listening to me. If I was, king for a day, and they drop a bomb, and it's, counterproductive. So, it's a lot of learning of both sides. And I think the other thing that's happening is you might notice in the industry a lot of talk about secure by design, memory-safe languages, open source security, supply chain. All of these issues all kind of are circling the same issue, is whether it's commercial code or open source code, essentially it's the same code. I think almost 80% of commercial products are open source.
Yeah, correct.
So even if it's closed source, it's really open source, right? Which then means the problems that open source faces are commercial problems. And so the supply chain, the Log4j, whatever it is, they're all starting to realize this, right? And so I think maybe the companies or the people that can adapt to that faster will have an advantage, or maybe be able to be more secure. And so you see the UK and the US, China, everybody's trying to come up with an open source supply chain security. They're all coming up with AI strategies. It's all happening kind of now. And so I think it's sort of our moment, but also don't screw it up. And the people who think that AI is going to take all of our jobs, like, no, they're not. They're not taking our jobs. We might do different jobs, but there's like, if you can't describe what you want the software to do, the AI can't write it, right? And so if a program manager can't even describe the features that needed in the program, the AI is never going to be able to write it. People don't always know what they want. So I just say the AI is going to be good for automation, let's take the boring, repetitive things away from the humans. Let the humans do the creative stuff, right, that they're good at. They're not great at looking at 100,000 lines of log code.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, absolutely. And brings up a very interesting question, right? There have been so many papers and publications that AI authors have submitted. And there was a huge debate in the academic community of what is allowed, disallowed. So my question to you is, at some stage, would you allow like an AI speaker? Because now with all the audio, visual and everything.
No. It's funny. So remember before AI, there was, what was the one, a university, they came up with like an algorithmically generated paper.
MIT had come up with something and it would just, create these
cobble
papers.
Together, right.
Yeah.
And I remember that year somebody tried submitting one. And they're like, oh, that's cool. You tried it. Good for you. But now, what we're finding is we get submissions and people use AI to help write their submissions. It's not writing it entirely, but it's, and so you'll be reading along and all of a sudden there's this paragraph and it's just not quite phrased correctly. Yeah. It's just a little weird. And so you search on some of those phrases and you see it come up. Like those are kind of like phrases used frequently in other AI generated text. So it's making our job more complicated. But I don't think the guy using the AI tool made the person any better.
Right.
I think it was like they were trying to get a submission out quickly, but that doesn't give us confidence that they know what they're talking about.
Right. I mean, last minute, very hurried research to probably like put something up. And,
I think if you were using it for maybe ad copy or some basic communications or summarization, I think is probably pretty useful.
Right.
But when you're trying to showcase your talents as an expert to provide a presentation, it takes away from it if we realize you're using automated tools, right? It's not your voice.
Right, absolutely. Jeff, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is you've inspired I think multiple generations of cybersecurity researchers and experts with your work at DEF CON and Black Hat. What motivates you? What still keeps you motivated? 30 years plus is not easy, right? Like I mean, I did a company, Pentester Academy, 10 years, sold it, moved on. 30 years. That's massive dedication. It's almost like kind of lifelong kind of like push towards something. So what keeps you motivated? What keeps you going?
I think the thing that the longevity is the team I've got at DEF CON, right? I've had some employees for over 20 years. Like we just all we all know how to do it. And there's a lot of creative people come and they get involved, and we've created a very I wouldn't say easy because nothing's easy, but we've created a way in which people can come and can contribute, and then they can leave, and they can come back, and they can leave. And so it's sort of like in your moment, if you want to help out, you can help out. And then we act as sort of the core organizer. And that formula, I think, is part of the story of the longevity. And it's interesting because when you're listening to governments, and the governments used to have these lifelong career employees. But now in tech, people are coming into government, they want to help out in some tech issue, then they want to go out and they want to try to start something up or solve something, they want to come back to government. And governments are facing the same problem. How do you create a situation where people can come and go to help the government and not have to commit their whole career?
Correct.
Right? Because otherwise they're not going to get the talent. Right. So they're being forced into the same kind of model that we accidentally fell into, which is, no, you don't have to get someone to commit their life to you. You can create an environment where they can help. I think that's part of it. The other part is the space is super dynamic and the people are really interesting. And there's always something new. And so if it was a much more static industry, I think, or maybe it's mature. So maybe in 20 years, maybe 30 years, if the industry's really matured and I live to 200 years old, maybe it would be pretty boring by then, But I was thinking if it was the car industry, but the car industry has always been disrupted. And I bet the car industry today is pretty dynamic and exciting. So maybe it's just kind of if you have a passion in what you do, I didn't grow up thinking that this was what I was going to do. I wanted to be a FBI agent. We'd chase bad guys. Yeah.
And what is your vision for DEF CON the next 10, 20 years and beyond? How are you planning to kind of
You can't, you can't think that far in the future. Originally, it was like you'd think 1 year in the future. Yeah. Are we so burned out? Are we going to do this again? And then it got to the point where You have to think a couple years in advance. Because you just don't know whether there's another COVID or another. But the idea is essentially, is what we're doing helping hackers? And what I mean by hackers, I mean the hacking mindset. And what I mean by that is, are you helping people like create like spontaneous discovery, enjoyment, the joy in the unknown, it's being safe to fail, right? Being able to admit that you don't know something, right? Being able to ask a question and not feel like somebody's going to punch down on you because you don't know, right? And so it's a lot more thought about like how do you create the environment, the platform, the community, to create those environments, and then people will fill it in. So it's a little bit more, how do you get a little bit more hands off? But the lens that we look through it now, since there's an endless supply of InfoSec conferences. I mean, when we started, I think there was 3 or 4. Now there's thousands, right? When we started DEF CON, there's like 5 hacking conferences. Now there's hundreds. But people still come to us. So we must have something that's different. And one of the things I think that's different is the way that we approach that sort of embracing that sort of hacker spirit, right? Getting the technology, understanding what it can do, speaking truth to power. So now when we review content or think about it, we go, well, is that hacker? If it is, then we should probably have it. If it's InfoSec and it's going to help advance your career, go to these unlimited number of other InfoSec conferences. And a friend sort of said, I send people to Black Hat to hone their skills, right? Like to sharpen the edge of the knife a little bit more to get fantastic. But then I send them to DEF CON to learn how to think.
Makes sense.
Right? And they're kind of 2 different paths. And so we've been doubling down more on that, how to think, how to...
That makes sense, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Jeff, over the past 30 years, how have you seen like cybersecurity, hacking, hackers, all of that kind of like evolve? I guess,
it's tough because we had that term to ourselves, right? We were hackers.
True.
And then the computer criminals... Right, the press didn't know instead of calling a computer criminal or a computer criminal, they had to take our term, right? Hacker. So then they came up with these alternative terms. It was going to be a spider. But then the World Wide Web was invented. And so that didn't work, right? Then there's going to be a cracker. But the software piracy world already had crackers, right? Specialists in removing copy protection, right? So they were going to encroach on some other part of the community's terminology. That didn't work. So it came back to hacker. And so it's always been this tension, right, by what do you mean by hacker? And you see it to this day, right? Hackers attacked, it's like, no, that was Iran attacking, right? That was North Korea attacking, right? That wasn't a hacker in North Korea, right? And so they still have all this confused terminology, and we can't adjust our reality to meet them. We just use the word the way in which it's always been used for us, right? It's our community. Because otherwise, if you adapt yourself to everybody else, you'll never know who you are.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a very good point. And I can actually tell you a very funny incident which happened at my home is, my son came to me and he basically said, Dad, what do you do? And I told him, well, why don't you go Google? And he Googled, and because of the old DEF CON talks and everything which were there and a couple of articles people had written, it said, oh, Vivek Ramachandran is a hacker. And then he comes back to me and he immediately says, do you steal things from people?
right.
And then you realize, as you rightly said, the mainstream narrative around, hacker and hacking has unfortunately, gotten negative without them really understanding, all the curiosity and all the experimentation, which was kind of the original thinking behind who a hacker would be.
Right.
And of course, I had given you this when we met the very first time. And that was the reason I even wrote a little comic. So that I could just give it to my son and other kids and say, you know what, like hacking is more about curiosity, interest, pushing things to the limit, being able to learn new things, almost living, at the edge when it comes to understanding technology and kind of pushing the barriers of what is possible rather than this whole unfortunate mainstream narrative.
Yeah, but I mean, they needed a word and they grabbed it, but
So Jeff, I kind of wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit about, something we've discussed a bunch of times, which is, consumer enterprise security, but primarily when it comes to users being online and attackers kind of like targeting them when they're online. So very curious about your thoughts of what do you think about like where end user security is today when it comes to online threats and
I think it was the very first DEF CON, so almost 32 years ago, there was a talk given by this guy, Dead Addict. And he was talking about what will life be like when we're always connected. Because before then, it was all dial-up. But we're moving to this DSL. Your computer's always on.
Right.
Well, that means you can always be attacked. Well, what's that going to do, right? Because before, like, you would just hang up the phone, you're done. Well, if somebody was in the middle of an attack, attack fails, right? Connection closed. And so it was a lot of speculating. And it's like, well, it's going to be crazy because there's going to be you're always either leaking something. They're always able to enumerate, and scan you. There's always this back and forth, and it's happening whether you're awake or you're asleep. And you fast forward to today, and it's like that to the 10th degree.
Right.
At one point, the security was the centralized firewall, right? And it's like hard. But within the need for persistent encryption, right, you need these encrypted connections from a client through your perimeter gateway, right, to the service. So, and you can't necessarily inspect that unless you jump through a lot of hoops. So what has happened is the security barrier has gotten closer and closer and closer to the edge, right, or to the end user.
Right.
And so as an administrator, it's hard to protect the end user, especially if it's their own device. And that's where everything's pushed, right? And if you look at like DNS, DOT, DOH, right? DNS over HTTP, right?
Yeah.
So it's encrypted DNS, and the idea there is a privacy reaction to the Snowden leaks, which was, well, we don't trust the ISP. Right. We don't trust the hotel we're in. We don't trust the cyber cafe. Right. We need to encrypt these questions, these DNS queries. We need to get them far away from where you are. So then the person that's seeing them isn't the room you're in, isn't in the cafe. Right. So yes, you can still have harms, but the harms are now further away. Right. Protect the person, especially if they're maybe in a different kind of a country without the same press freedoms or religious freedoms. Right. So the trade-off there is it's better to try to protect that core. Well, now the administrator, it's harder for the administrator to know that your machine's infected and is now asking for malware over DNS because it's encrypted. So the only way to know is to then get to the right end user device. So what's kind of happening is because of the privacy enhancements, everything's getting to the end user. But because of that, the security has to get to the end user. And so it seems like mainframe computers, right, when everything was centralized, the minis, right, thin computing, right, now everything is at the edge. And I mean, not everything. Obviously, there's a centralized DNS server, mail server, web server, and all that. But as far as you said consumers, it has to get as close to the consumer as possible.
Right. No, absolutely. And Jeff, this was one of the things we had seen as well. And when I was running Pen Tester Academy, at that point in time, I was working with a lot of red teams and all of those folks. And the very first initial access onto a user system was really via the browser.
Yeah.
Because we figured out it's so easy to go ahead and, concoct a spear phishing attack or a drive-by download. And now with people spending almost 90% of their time on the browser, researching, going to random websites.
Well, it's PDFs, it's file attachments, right? It's a JavaScript in a web browser. I mean, I bet that's probably 80% of the problem.
Yes.
Right? And it's been 80% of the problem for decades, and you would think that would get better, but then we have then it's WASM, then it's this, then it's that. And it just keeps getting more, every time we solve something, it gets more common. We got rid of Flash. But then we got, so.
The Flash part was like, for so many years, there is always used to be multiple exploits, which used to be found in, the Flash runtime.
Yeah.
And, everywhere you used to see people disclosing those bugs, using it for active exploitation. Mm. So I guess that was a very big relief. And eventually Chrome literally did away with the whole plugin architecture.
Right.
Where really now you cannot have a third-party plugin kind of running, even though, of course, you have extensions, but they're kind of ring-fenced and sandboxed.
Yeah. So you can see that's the direction. And it makes me a little sad that there's a centralization occurring where there's a few giant
That's true.
mail providers, a few giant DNS providers, and I get it. It's more complicated. It's more denial of service. You need more resources. Every bit is. It used to be simple to run a name server. Now there's so much to name servers, right? There's a DNSSEC, and there's the encrypted part, and then there's alternative, and now there's H3 and alt services. And it just mail used to be simple, right? And now that's complicated. And so I could see why. But if you think about it, what's happening is it's getting more and more out of touch for the average person, right? Unless you're already sort of an expert, it's hard for you to understand what's going on.
Right.
Where when we started, everything was fairly simple.
Yeah.
And we've had the benefit of watching the simple become complicated.
And that is really where, for a very long period, especially when cloud became very popular and interesting and everybody was trying to migrate into the cloud, I think a lot of security products started becoming cloud first as well. A perfect example are these secure web gateways, which are really, cloud proxies doing SSL interception, doing all of that monitoring and trying to figure out if end users are being attacked.
Right.
Now, of course, back in the day, 7 to 10 years back, web applications weren't complex. You could really go ahead and just look at HTML, CSS, JavaScript and files and probably do all of that scanning. But now with things becoming, so overly complex, one of the things that we saw very early on is, SWGs or secure web gateways are looking at network traffic to infer application layer attacks.
This reminds me, so I mentioned earlier this company, Security Computing Corporation. So their flagship product was this firewall called the Sidewinder.
Okay.
People knew this product more than they knew the company, right? So, and the big magic with Sidewinder is it had application proxies, right?
Okay.
So I think we had like 23 application-aware proxies. So when you would send FTP through it, you actually talked FTP to the firewall. And the firewall would sit, and you could tell it like, don't allow this get, only allow this put, don't do this, allow that. And you had total control. Same thing with HTTP, right? I could filter at the firewall which headers were allowed in, which headers were allowed out, how long different URL query, everything. I had all this control because of this application. But once the space started moving faster, they couldn't keep these proxies up to date, right? Things were always breaking. So then eventually you'd have to let a generic traffic through, and then it ended up looking like all these other firewalls, which are just circuit gateway or circuit proxies. And that's sort of what is happening a little bit here, where I think the cloud firewalls, right, they're trying to do what we did 25 years ago, which was application-aware proxy. We'll accept it, and we'll decrypt it, and then we'll send it on. But then you're going to end up in the same situation, I think.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And, we still remember deep packet inspection, layer 7 and beyond and all of that. And you brought up a very good point is now what's ended up happening is almost all communication has started getting chunked through HTTPS ports, where every application talks through it because that's what most organizations have probably enabled on the firewall and whatnot, making it impossibly difficult to have some kind of application-aware HTTPS proxy, which can maybe even reconstruct what could be happening on the user screen. And this clearly can't work because of exactly what you mentioned. And that is really where, Jeff, you and I have had all these conversations where, with SquareX, what we are trying to do is basically then go to where you have the richest metrics, go to where you fully understand how the user is interacting, with the application. And that is really the browser.
Well, it was the endpoint, right? Security, right? It was device management, MDM, whatever it is, right? That's the enterprise trying to get closer to the device and control the device and set policies around it. And then the endpoint management, same thing, right? But then the browser is essentially not the email client. The browser has become essentially a whole nother computer, right? And you see this on the mobile phone if you use WeChat. Like WeChat in China is a whole nother ecosystem with apps, with payment play, everything.
Super app.
Same things happen with the browser, right? And so if you're not in the browser, it's sort of like not being in the endpoint. Right?
Absolutely. You brought up a very good point. And I think, endpoint security, the time when, all of that came in was when we were still downloading files and you used to find like viruses and all of that kind of like show up in your downloads. When was the last time any of us saw a little virus alert? Like,
Right.
honestly, I want to be surprised one of the days because it would bring back fond memories.
Fond memories, yeah.
And that is really where, with all work moving inside the browser, one of the things that we realized, and we've had so many discussions around this as well, is thinking about a browser native security product. And to your point, now that browsers are so capable as a platform, with Chromium, having so many different things in it, web GPUs, support for WebAssembly, and all the big players going ahead and using that as a base. I mean, Edge is built off Chromium as well.
Right.
Now there's a real opportunity here to build security products which reside literally where all the action is happening.
Right.
Which, as you said, in the previous generation was endpoint security products, and now within the browser. And that is really where what we've been very strongly feeling is, look, if you have something sitting in the browser, looking at how events are happening, whether it's DOM changes, browser events and all of that, that gives you such amount of rich data for your algorithms that you can probably create better detection, better monitoring, better visibility.
Yeah, it was originally sort of like containment. I think the original browser security product I saw was this product called Green Border, and Google ended up buying them. But essentially, it was a virtualization technique back when that was new. And it would put a green border around your browser. And it only understood a couple browsers. But if you were within the green border, what you were doing was safe. It was virtualizing registry calls. So whatever happened in the browser, when you got done browsing, it would revert.
Yeah.
So it gave you this freedom back then when the web was pretty polluted. You could just go wherever you want. No big deal. I'm in the green border. And then their goal was to have a green border for the email client and this and that, and until everything is... But it turns out now that people are doing enough stuff in the browser, doing the banking in. It doesn't matter if it's virtualized or not. They'll still, if they can jump tabs and run a macro and change the password over UPnP of your gateway, or steal money out of you're logged into Amazon, you're logged into your bank or Netflix. So it turned out that became less valuable. I mean, it prevents an escape out into the main. Right. But the money turns out not to be maybe in an escape. The money is still within the browser because the money is within these giant monolithic web services now.
Correct. And I mean, you brought up a very good point, because if you think about it, I mean, we rarely download things anymore, onto our computers. Everything is in cloud storage and whatnot. So to your point, if somebody ends up, doing a credential stealing attack or an identity stealing attack, they could just log into your cloud, storage, to AWS or wherever, and steal the rest of the data.
Right.
So attacks are now completely living and dying entirely within the browser itself, with no real need for any endpoint interaction to happen. And
think about it. Like, normally you could look at your network log. Like, I don't know where maybe I'm behind the times, but I don't know where I go to Firefox and get my log.
Yeah.
Right? That says, you opened a window X at this time and you clicked on this thing, and here's how do you reconstruct any of that?
Yeah.
Right.
You brought up an excellent point, right? So one of the things we've been seeing is most of the attacks, because they happen online. I mean, imagine that, for a large company, they have a big sales force. And now with the economy and everything, still not doing great. Sales team are so super aggressive. So attackers have started going ahead and contacting them in places like LinkedIn, where they end up, sending them probably a copy of an invoice which contains a malicious macro.
Right.
Now, your sales team ends up multiple people, clicking through those links and finally downloading something. Now, endpoint security, the only thing it can tell you is, Tom, Dick, and Harry in your organization ended up downloading a piece of ransomware via Chrome. The whole attack attribution, to your point, what really happened, which led to the final download, is something, unfortunately, which currently today is totally invisible to security and IT teams.
Right. Because they don't know that they got redirected to 5 different sites maybe, and how they initially got the link in the first place.
Exactly. And because of that, attackers will always go ahead and very quickly change the last point from where those downloads are happening. And of course, if you go to employees and ask them, hey, what happened? They either don't remember or don't want to tell.
Yeah, well, there's this thing. We talked about it maybe 20, 25 years ago. Safety engineering, right? And so for vehicles, there's some thought that was put into, not every car, but many cars, when you're driving and you get near the edge of your performance envelope, right? Your steering wheel is kind of like, and you internalize, you're like, oh, this isn't right. I better slow down, right? I'm near the edge of, it doesn't like you're driving along and then the car explodes. It's like you get into this one state that's weird, right? And so we were always joking that maybe we should make a mouse with a little buzzer in it. And you're mousing around and you hover over a link and the safe watch list says that's a bad link. Right. And your mouse is like, nerd, nerd. Like, oh, I'm not clicking that. But there's no feedback loop. Right. So the user has no incentive, no way of improving their online behavior because they don't know when they make a bad decision.
Correct.
And with some of these attacks, you make a bad decision and you don't know it for 2 weeks or a month or maybe never.
Right.
So how do you know to ever change your behavior? And so kind of what you were saying earlier, right? The Salesforce guy might never realize he's been auto-directed through everything. Correct. Or might not even, he might have a valid PDF, but it might have some other junk in there, right? So there's no lesson for them to learn to improve their behavior.
Exactly. And that's a very good point. And really that is where security awareness, unfortunately, today within organizations is very flat. In the sense, all people end up getting is this email or a bunch of questions that they have to go through in order to be security aware.
Yeah.
And to your point, because of the lack of contextual security awareness, I mean, like imagine at that point in time, if the user ended up getting, it's like, hey, Tom, hey, Jack, this message that you received on LinkedIn was actually used to go ahead and try to break into your system with ransomware.
Right.
I think the very next time they receive a LinkedIn message with an attachment, that's going to make them automatically suspicious and maybe open that up.
I mean, you have two choices, right? You either help improve so they can make better decisions, which means you need to have signals for them to pick up, right?
Correct.
Or you just make the products and the environment more intrinsically safe so they don't have to worry about it.
Right.
And you probably have to pursue both, but thinking that you're going to do it with just education, it's not going to work, especially if there's no signals, and you're probably not going to create a impervious environment, right?
Right.
But I always get frustrated when people start saying that I'm paying a lot of money for spear phishing testing. I'm like, okay, and then what?
Exactly. That's a very good point. And I think, many a times these simulations, as you rightly said, there are these one-off attacks which people look at and then kind of just move on. So, there's no secure by design, secure by use kind of a philosophy kind of like in there when it comes to these attack simulations. So one of the big reasons why, we ended up starting SquareX is we were trying to see if we could solve some of these problems by sitting right there in the browser. Almost like being like a security assistant to the user, so that when he probably ends up doing something wrong, when we end up detecting an attack, we can immediately warn him, tell him, teach and educate him. So that to your point, in a way, it is that little buzz which can happen in that mouse. And you start to become more and more security conscious and see how attackers are attacking you. Yeah. So, of course, Jeff, we were very honored and privileged when you accepted to be an advisor to the company. Just wanted to ask you, what did you like about, SquareX and what we were doing?
Yeah, I've, like you pointed out, I've been around a while. I've seen a lot of products. I was in the product space. I've purchased products and used them, and it's really you need to get as close to the problem as you can. And so the further away from the problem you are, you end up doing a lot of hand waving and half measures because you don't have enough tools. Right. So you either need to be at all the way on one end or all the way on the other. And so when talking to you, SquareX, all the way in the browser, sort of instead of cloud native, you're browser native. Yeah. Like, okay, that makes sense, right? I don't know if it's going to work, but it makes a lot of sense, and it needs to be explored because if it can be done, then that's the next frontier. Right? And it won't be just SquareX, it'll be a lot of others, but you're there first and you're innovating. And just like we happen to sort of be there first with DEF CON and innovating, it leads to all other kinds of interesting outcomes, right? And the other thing I think we haven't really talked about is that, yes, we mentioned that the browser is becoming its own kind of computer, its own ecosystem, but then things that were traditionally standalone, Office. Microsoft Office was a freaking app on your computer. Now it's a web thing, right? I access my traditional Office apps through the web browser. Email, all through the browser now. I mean, the browser's eating the world,
Right.
Right? And so it's not
Absolutely.
like I have one tool to protect my office and my local files, and I have another tool to protect my. It's like, no, it's all in one place now,
Right.
right? It's all in the browser.
No, that's a very good point. And actually, one of the big reasons why we decided to pick that up is we felt like, over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, the gateway to the internet will probably still remain the browser. Of course, the browser itself may, change
Yeah.
in different ways. But that way, by being at the exact gate where people end up accessing the internet, doing their transactions and all of that, we thought that we could end up creating something, which is a little bit more timeless, which can adapt with, how technology changes.
Right. I mean, whether the browser becomes the computer, you still have to do the same thing. You still have to parse the DOM. You still have to analyze, right, the calls. You still have to deserialize the JSON, whatever it is, right? You still have to do that. So learning how to do that is going to be valuable.
And one of the other interesting, I would say twists that we ended up doing is a lot of people are very privacy conscious today, right? People hate the fact that, imagine that in your email, you received a bunch of documents. Now a security product needs to ship it all the way back to their servers to analyze.
Well, did you just see I think it was an announcement last week before, Slack is taking all of your corporate chats and training its large language model?
Crazy.
The AI
Shocking,
AI is eating all the proprietary information, right? And so I think there's a privacy play angle, right? As a hacker, I want to control my data, and so if I can do it on my side, great. I mean, I don't have the cloud Office apps.
Right.
Others do, but I don't. I like to have it local. But I think the more you can do, right? Can you imagine having to go to your legal department if you worked in a company, right, and explain to the compliance why you need to have all your corporate secrets shipped off over Slack or whatever it is, right?
Right.
Like, you want to make it easy for people to.
Yeah. And that's really where, Jeff, what we are doing is, two things. One is we are trying to go ahead and do all of this malicious analysis and everything in the browser itself using WebAssembly. Mm-hmm. So as a simple example, let's say there's a malicious document which is showing up in your Gmail. Right there in the browser, we can look at it, unpack it, look at the macro, look at the P code, look at the compressed source code, and run our algorithms. And our whole perspective was that people need to feel safe when a security product is working on their data. Mm-hmm. And the best way to probably do that and be privacy safe is if you can run right there on the user's machine.
And you saw this a little bit with Apple. Remember, maybe 6 years ago, there was a terrorist incident, and the FBI was trying to unlock. Yes, yeah. They're trying to unlock an iPhone, and Apple was like, "Oh, we don't want to really unlock that for you, or we can't, right? Without destroying the master secret to unlock, And you could see the thinking essentially at Apple, which was, we don't want to be in the business of answering subpoenas, right? They have hundreds of lawyers. They don't want to have thousands of lawyers, right? To do nothing but accept. And so you don't want to be in the business of doing stuff somewhere else where you can be subpoenaed. You want it done on the device, right? You want to engineer yourself out of that problem where the customer has control of their data, right? They can come to you, but you can't help them because otherwise you'll have a whole new product, which is called hire the lawyers, right? And that's not what you're in this for, right? And so you can solve a couple of problems by engineering yourself out of trying to suck everybody's data into your center, grind it, or AI train it, or whatever.
Right.
Anyway, that's just my advice: is just stay out of that game as long as you can, because it doesn't pay, right? It only costs.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is that the end user devices are only going to get faster. Right now, they have more AI dedicated chips. The new CPUs do more floating point, everything. And so that analysis that you can do at the endpoint is going to be way more powerful, essentially, than what you could pay for to do it in your central cloud, right? So going forward, it's only going to get better and better at the endpoint.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The tailwind here is really that, end user devices are getting more and more capable, more and more powerful, have more CPU, RAM to kind of spare, and that definitely allows us to do most of those calculations right there.
The GPUs now on some laptops are more powerful than desktop GPUs from only 8-9 years ago.
Correct.
So it's that's the future you plan for.
Yeah. And one of the things we are trying to do as well is, we've given out a free consumer version, and we are hoping that, a large part of it we can even make open source for other people to contribute. And one of the parts that we are thinking about is this whole like in-browser analysis system, because we feel like that way, not just, of course, enterprise users that we are targeting, but hopefully a large part, of the internet would one day end up using something like that.
Yeah, more than just an F12 debug or developer mode, right?
Exactly.
This is more like, not really forensics mode, but it's analysis mode maybe. I don't know what you would call it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff, I think this has been an exciting conversation. There's always so much I learn from you, every time that we speak.
Yeah.
Before we close, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts. There's so many people trying to get into cybersecurity, build careers in it, do research. Any kind of like, I think pearls of wisdom, any motivation or anything that you want to kind of tell them, like how should they begin? I know this is a common question you get.
Well, I'm far away from it now, right? I'm kind of in my career, so I couldn't tell you what it is, but I have a couple observations I'll give. One is try to do what you're passionate about. It's worked for me.
Right.
Of course, I've done every job. I've pool chemical delivery, pizza delivery. I've done all kinds of things, right? But the thing I was always passionate about was computers, and I found my way. But when I would interview someone, I would always ask, okay, but what have you done? Oh, I've got this degree or I've got this certification. I'm like, okay, so tell me about your home network. And they're like, well, I don't have a home network. It's like, oh, okay, that's fine. Do you contribute to any projects? Nope. And it's like, oh, okay, well, it's hard for me then to understand what it is that you do or how I'll, So think about how you show your passion. So what is it that you do? What have you built? What have you contributed to? And then the second part I would say is when I started, computer security was computer security. There's nothing else. Right. Now, computer security is everywhere. You could be a lawyer and do computer security. You could be an engineer with security, right? Security is in so many aspects of life now. You don't necessarily have to think of yourself as I'm a computer security person. You might love healthcare, and computer security. So don't constrain yourself into putting yourself in a bucket, right? You can maybe do two things that you enjoy, computer security and, online movie editing software, whatever it is. And so I would just say keep an open mind because it's going to change again, right? It's just getting broader. And it's followed this trajectory of, well, now if you're into government policy, now it's in that, right? It's in economics. So don't constrain yourself. Find what you're passionate about, and then find a way to demonstrate that. Because this AI job. Oh, and finally, I hate to say this, but it's who you know, largely, right? A lot of your breaks in life are going to come from your friends of friends. You're going to work with someone. They're going to remember you. They're going to recommend you to someone else. Very rarely have I ever heard somebody say, I got a blind hit on a resume. Right. It's almost always through somebody who knew someone who knew somebody. So while you need to have your technical skills, put some energy into your people skills. Because ultimately, people are going to hire you. You're going to manage or be managed by people. You need some people skills, even if it's just to communicate a little bit about what you're doing. Because when you look at the trajectory of people who are successful in software development, at some point, it's no longer about the technology. It's about managing the team, communicating what the team's up to, understanding the business need, managing the budget, all these other things which have nothing to do with.
Right.
But you don't get there unless you start here. And so.
No, I think that's great advice, especially the last part which you kind of mentioned about, networking, kind of going out there, talking to people, being a little bit of a people's person.
Yeah.
Because I guess without that, as you rightly said, finally people have to like working with you.
Well, you can hover on LinkedIn your whole life, but that doesn't really, I think that's after you've made connection with, you have a personal connection with them or with the company, right? And so I don't like that being somewhat of an introvert. But if I look back, like when I've been in trouble and I go and I ask for help from friends, right? I don't get help from random LinkedIn,
people, yeah.
right? It's so I think you need to build your, and you need to understand with some kind of intention that, hey, you just triggered a memory. What you're doing is when you're building your network, it's like that early days of hacking when you had your mentorship and you built your reputation.
Right.
What you're doing is you're building your reputation, and just don't make any shortcuts when you're building your reputation, because that will pay off for the rest of your life. If you have a reputation as someone who always comes through when you say you will, or when you don't come through, you admit to it, or when you don't know the answer, you say, hey, I don't know, but I'll find out, right? Those will pay you dividends. But if you always are the yes person and you fake it until you make it, then that'll blow up in your face.
Yeah, so that's a very good point, Jeff. Around building networks, especially for cybersecurity folks, as you mentioned, many of us technical folks are kind of introvert.
Yeah.
And it takes a little bit of time to kind of like open up. One of the things I've seen with a lot of people is they get very frustrated or kind of give up when they try to reach out to people, probably a couple of levels beyond them.
Yeah.
And they don't get responses. What is your advice?
Yeah, I'm guilty of that too. Sometimes people reach out to me, and I almost wish I had like a form letter, which is, I'm fine talking to anybody, but when you come to me, you've got to have an ask.
Yes,
right. You've got to come to me for a reason or a purpose, because otherwise, I hear your story and I think, okay, good luck.
Yeah.
Like it's unclear. Like, what do they want from me, or how can I help them?
Yeah.
Right. And so. So if you are approaching people, just, hey, I'm doing this project. I saw that you contributed to it. Hey, can you help steer me? Or do you mind answering a question? I've looked at A, B, and C, and it's unclear to me. But if you just come at me and say, I've done no research, and I want you to guide me, I have no idea where to steer you. But if you say, I've followed this guy's work and this guy's work, and I want to do network, I don't like to do, okay, then maybe I have a chance of helping you. And so I would say people are really open in this industry because so much of it is changing rapidly, and nobody knows all the answers. And if you find somebody who says they know all the answers, they don't, right? Yeah. So what you want to do is you're trying to identify people who are willing to admit when they don't know and help you. And those are the people you stick with, right? So you want to do the same thing in return, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, and you brought up a very good point. I've seen you end up receiving a lot of messages where people just say hi and that's it.
And you're like, okay,
what am I supposed to do now?
Are you a bot? Are you a human? Are you trained? What do you do with that?
Yeah. Or very generic points like, I want to get into cybersecurity. Give me advice, right?
Right. And there used to be a couple pages where you would send people like, oh, hey, read this first, and then come back to me, right? But you figure with Google, that was kind of pre-Google. With Google, it's like, if you haven't even searched on this first, then how can I help you? You have to have enough of a...
Exactly. And one of the other things I can tell, folks who are watching this is, many a times if you're going ahead and contacting people who are very busy, you also have to understand that, they do take time to kind of respond and not to get dissuaded with that.
Right.
And the simple reason is, they have their own work, they have their own lives, and, of course, that is a bigger priority for them. And to not kind of take that in the wrong way, but instead, just keep reminding them and kind of connecting back to them. And that has actually worked tremendously well for me.
Yeah. I think you just have to show that you've put in the work, you put in enough energy before you approach them, right? Yeah. It's the, what was on Usenet? It was the Me Too +1, right? If it's just and help me too. It's like, well, there were some people at ICANN, super famous people, and you'd see it happen to them over and over and over, and they want to help. There's only so many hours in the day. Right. But when somebody came to them with a paper, described the problem, here's my work, I can dig into that. Right. And you can see how your time will help. But when it's like, are we just going to have a conversation? Then, there's only limited hours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. This was amazing. Thank you so much for spending so much time. It's an honor and privilege to have you as the very first, speaker with us when we started this podcast. And thanks again for advising the company and me. I've learned a lot. All the best for DEF CON this year. We are going to be there in full force.
Yes, good.
And I think, post DEF CON, of course, we would love to connect back with you and discuss once again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, best of luck.